Welcome to Talk to Internal Audit, our dedicated Facebook Live series. Today's session is about our recently launched Risk in Focus report, what it is and why it's important to internal auditors. Our guest is Gavin Hayes, Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Chartered IIA UK and Ireland. So grab a drink, tea, coffee, whichever is your favourite, and join me as we delve into gaining a better understanding of the key risks for 2023, based on the research undertaken by the Chartered IIA and colleagues across Europe that informed the annual Risk in Focus report, and how we as internal auditors need to consider these very topical risks. So, I'm Liz Sandwith, and I'm the Chief Professional Practices Advisor for the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, UK and Ireland. Before we get into the stream, a couple of facts about the Institute for you to keep in mind. These will shortly appear on your screen. As you may be aware, you can acquire CPE points for these Talk to Internal Audit sessions by logging them using our CPE template. Details of how to claim CPE from this live stream can be found in the comments section. So as I mentioned, today's topic is Risk in Focus 2023. Hopefully you have downloaded the report and already started delving into some of the risks. I don't think it's something you read from start to finish in one sitting, but I think it is an invaluable reference document, and I would expect that perhaps you have saved it on your desktop so that you can dip in and out of it during the working day. This year, the report explores 5 thematic risks: geopolitical uncertainty, climate change, organizational culture, cyber and data risk, and digitization and artificial intelligence. It outlines those challenges in detail, offers practical advice and know-how about how to help your organization adjust to this new reality. As I'm sure you were aware, in 2022, organizations were hit by a perfect storm of high-impact interlocking risks that have thrown businesses into a permanent state of crisis. Following hard on the heels of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine has intensified supply chain failures, caused a spike in energy prices, and fueled inflation. Now, some might say a state of crisis is the new normality. Climate-related natural disasters, looming recession, an accelerating cost of living catastrophe in Europe, food shortages, employee welfare and skills deficits, and a rapidly industrializing cyber attack landscape are overlaid by intensifying geopolitical tensions and the very real threat of financial liquidity and solvency risks for businesses. Gosh, doesn't that sound terrifying, perhaps? As internal auditors, we need to get a rapid grip on this situation and support our organizations to navigate more risky, uncertain, and volatile times ahead. So instead of thinking about what individual risks might arise over the next year or two, as internal auditors, chief audit execs, we need to be thinking over the coming decade and be thinking big. How would we, your organization, survive an overnight permanent supply chain break with China? assuming the China-Taiwan situation materializes? How would we cope if inflation hit 25% and stayed there as it did in the 1970s? Are we prepared for the sudden permanent increase in temperatures in every area in which we operate? Are we able to understand and help our clients and staff with the stresses and strains they face over the coming months and years? In the first half of 2022, a quantitative survey was distributed among chief audit execs by 14 European institutes of internal auditors spanning 15 countries, including Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. The survey elicited 834 responses, an all-time high for this research project. It's also important, and forgive me listing all the countries, but I think it's also important, particularly if you have a global footprint, or certainly a European footprint, that you understand who has actually contributed to the report. The report is also of relevance to a broader range of governance stakeholders, thinking about your audit committee chairs, board members, risk management, along with other assurance and governance professionals. As a tool, the Risk in Focus report should be used to inform internal audit's thinking in drafting their annual plans, and it provides a benchmark against which chief audit execs can contrast and compare their own independent risk assessment. As I hinted at earlier, the top 5 risks identified in the report were macroeconomic and geopolitical risk, emerging and strategic risk, auditing in a time of crisis, climate change and environmental sustainability, transition to climate change auditing, human capital, diversity and talent management, the human factor, cybersecurity and data security, auditing at the speed of crime, digital disruption and new technology, switching to automatic. Remember, if you like Facebook streams and want to spread the word, and I'm sure you do, be sure to share today's live stream. You can do so by clicking the share button in the corner of your screen. After all, the more the merrier. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream, Talk to Internal Audit. Our guest speaker today is Gavin Hayes, who's Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. So may I introduce my guest and close colleague, Gavin Hayes. Gavin, my first question for you, please, will you introduce yourself and share some background that leads you to be involved in the annual Risk in Focus report?
Well, thanks, Liz, for that very warm introduction. I head up the Chartered IA's Policy and External Affairs function, and part of this work includes leading our Thought Leadership programme. And of course, our flagship Thought Leadership project is Risk in Focus, which we publish every September. And Liz, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, Risk in Focus is a collaboration with 13 other European institutes of internal auditors. And the project is governed by a group that's called the European Institutes Research Group. And the Chartered IA UK and Ireland is the lead European institute and project manager for the Risk in Focus project.
Thank you for that, Gavin. That was really helpful and provides some great context for what we're going to be looking at. So may I start with some headlines that we will dive into a little deeper shortly? What do you and your colleagues see as the purpose of the Risk in Focus annual report?
So the purpose of Risk in Focus is to inform internal audit's thinking as they prepare their audit plans for the year ahead. It's designed to really challenge internal audit functions to ask themselves whether they're focusing on the big emerging strategic risks that are coming down the track. And we want to really use Risk in Focus as a catalyst for debate and discussion amongst the internal audit community on the key risks where they can add most value.
Thank you for that, Gavin. And you've anticipated my next headline, which was, how should our internal audit colleagues use the report? And you said as a catalyst. Have you had feedback from internal auditors, heads of internal audit, CAEs, about how they use the report?
Yeah, well, I think the important thing to say here, Liz, is that Risk in Focus is not intended to be prescriptive in any way. It's more food for thought, but the piece purposely aims to be hard-hitting, provocative, and challenging. And as well as providing narrative on the 5 thematic risks that we believe deserve particular focus and attention over the coming year and beyond, it also includes useful practical tips on what internal audit can do to help support their organisations on each of the risk areas. And also, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, we also hope that the report won't just be picked up and read once, is used as a reference point on each of the key risks throughout the course of the year.
Thank you ever so much, Gavin. And you're so right. It isn't something you pick up, read once and file. It's something that you delve into and reference across a number of audits across the year. So we've talked about targeting internal audit stakeholders, for example, audit committees or audit and risk committees, our risk colleagues, our CEO. If so, how do we actually do that? Do we expect them to read the Risk in Focus report, or is there an alternative?
So we are absolutely targeting the report and its key messages at a broader range of risk and governance stakeholders. So the contents of Risk in Focus are obviously just as relevant to board members, including, of course, audit committees, as well as risk professionals in the second line, and also, of course, senior management in the first line. But to make Risk in Focus even more accessible this year, we've also published a shorter board briefing, and we would certainly encourage internal auditors tuning into this live stream to share the board briefing with your audit committee members, senior management, and the rest of the board.
Thank you very much. And it is really useful. It's relatively short, very sharp, very focused is the board briefing. And I'm sure will be incredibly valuable to your audit committee chair and members in particular in terms of a dialogue that will start the conversation around what you put in your internal audit plan when you present it to them. So please do as Gavin suggests and share it. So one of the questions, Gavin, I get asked, not often, but occasionally, is the Risk in Focus report applicable for all sectors, public, private, and financial services?
Yeah, absolutely. Risk in Focus is applicable across all sectors, and we would really encourage all internal auditors to read the report and benefit from its insights.
Thank you very much. I think sometimes some of the risks appear to be less relevant to some sectors, but I think that's perhaps a little short-sighted. of my internal audit colleagues, and I think they need to read the sections of the report, the risks, read the helpful tips you provide, the internal audit perspective, so they can see how it relates to different sectors. So great comment, Gavin, and thank you for that. So I notice for Risk in Focus 2023, you've changed the format of the report. May I ask why?
So yeah, the format has changed. In previous years, we provided narrative and chapters on each of the top 10 risks. This year, we've decided to focus instead on the 5 thematic risks that we believe deserve particular focus and attention. So this enables us to provide more of a deep dive on each of the risk areas covered in the report. But we should also be mindful that with all of the risks covered in the report, arguably none of them sit in a silo. They interconnect with a wide range of other risks, which reflects the increasing interconnectivity of the risk landscape that we're now grappling with. So you'll find some of the other top 10 risks woven in under some of the other risk headings. So for example, organizational culture is covered under the chapter on human capital diversity and talent management. And of course, this approach also creates scope to change the 5 key risk areas we focus on year. So this helps to keep the report fresh.
Thank you, Gavin. A really valid point, because I think, there's a superb Venn diagram at the beginning that looks at some of the perfect storm elements. And, I know some people have said to me, well, you talk there about supply chain, and but I can't see it as a risk. Well, actually, drill down into the macroeconomic geopolitical chapter, and you will find supply chain there, just as you will find sanctions there. So please don't read the headlines, read the report, read the chapters, because you will find there's an awful lot more in there than perhaps at first sight you think, and lots of stuff that's relevant, as Gavin has already mentioned. Would that be a fair comment, Gavin?
Yes, that is absolutely fair.
Thank you. So I noticed that human capital, diversity, talent management has moved to number 2 on the risk list. Do you have any thoughts as to what may have caused it to increase in severity?
So human capital diversity and talent management's rise to the number 2 spot should not really come as a big surprise, given the severe recruitment and retention challenges that many organisations have been grappling over the last year or two. And of course, some commentators have referred this as the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle, as employees have sought a greater work-life balance. And as I say, this really reflects the severe recruitment and retention challenges that we have seen. Of course, in addition to this, employees are now demanding that employers pay more attention to ensuring a healthy corporate culture, including a much greater focus on psychological safety and well-being, as well as a stronger sense of social purpose. At the same time, soaring inflation and demands for fair pay settlements is also stoking talent management challenges, as we've seen with the strikes that we've had here in the UK over the summer, but also in other places across Europe. So I think that those are the main drivers for that risk's rise in prominence.
Thank you, Gavin. It might also be worth mentioning that last year, when we looked at human capital diversity, talent management as one of the risks, we also did a breakout report. You, Gavin, and your team and colleagues did a breakout report around human capital diversity and talent management. So if this is particularly relevant to you, then have a look not just at Risk in Focus 2023, but also the drill down risk overview that we did last year in this particular area. Well worth thinking about. The other thing I was just going to mention, you mentioned psychological safety, Gavin, particularly important, I think, as people are, suffering from mental health, well-being issues, wanting to know that they can be safe in their organizations. They can try new things and fail and still feel safe and supported by their organizations. So we as Internal Audit have a role to play in contributing to that psychological safety issue, not just from an internal audit team. Your team should feel that they are safe within the internal audit function, but also across the organization. So the Institute, the Chartered Institute, has recently produced some technical guidance that we will be publishing very shortly, so look out for it, around auditing psychological safety. So wanting to ensure that, your organization is not just talking the talk, yay, we've got something around that, but is actually delivering a psychologically safe environment for the whole of your staff across your organization. Because I think that's going to become increasingly important as we move through the winter. We're already hearing horror stories of people's mortgages shooting up. Even though government has capped the fuel costs, they're still for some people, they're virtually double what last year was. So they're cutting down. I'm hearing stories of families recognizing they won't be able to put the heating on, use the tumble dryer, and maybe cutting back on hot meals. So I think it's going to be a very challenging winter. So I think, human capital diversity, talent management is an audit that needs to figure in your internal audit plan across 2023, because I think it's going to be a very challenging area for organizations, and how can internal audit contribute? Gavin, do you have any thoughts around what I've just said?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you've said, Liz. And of course, this was also, you touch upon the importance of psychological safety and well-being. And of course, this was also a focus area for our report that we published earlier in the year, Cultivating a Healthy Culture. And it's really a healthy corporate culture that underpins all of this. So I would also obviously encourage viewers to take a look at our report, Cultivating a Healthy Culture, which is available on the policy and research section of the website, if they haven't done so already, because that can also help.
Good shout, Gavin. I think people perhaps that are not necessarily UK and Ireland based don't realise how much information, reports is available on our website at no cost to them. So, Gavin has pointed you in the direction of the policy page on our website. Please do look at it. There are some phenomenal reports there that are well worth reading, reflecting, sharing with colleagues across your organisation. So Risk in Focus 2023 has forecasted that climate change is to increase in severity, priority as we move forward. So this is a bit, Gavin, your crystal ball gazing, I think. Do you have any thoughts as to why, as a risk, it wasn't nearer the top of the risk list following the instances of flooding, Pakistan, if you recall, high temperatures? Who knew in Leeds we would ever see a temperature of 40 degrees? Water shortages, food shortages across Europe and globally.
Well, I think on climate change, the key message to get across is that one of the big stories coming out of Risk in Focus over recent years is the ascendancy of climate change risk. For example, in Risk in Focus 2019, only 8% of CAEs cited climate a top 5 risk, and that figure now stands at 37%, and it's forecast to rise to around 50% within the next 3 years, which would then make it the third biggest risk. So it's absolutely swiftly rising up the agenda, and internal audit does need to take this risk a lot more seriously. However, I think something that we just need to be mindful of is that the survey was carried out in April 2022, and I rather suspect that if the survey had been carried out just a few months later, at the height of the record-breaking heat wave that you just alluded to, Liz, then climate change might have featured even higher in terms of this year's Risk in Focus. Of course, another really important message coming out of Risk in Focus is that whilst internal audit does recognise climate change as a key risk, still not enough internal auditors are spending enough time and effort on this risk area, which is reflected in the fact that it ranks 11th in terms of time and effort spent on the risk area. So we really want to see more internal auditors step up on climate change risk.
Thank you, Gavin. And I know you're running some roundtables at the moment, even as we speak, around geopolitical risk and macroeconomic risk, and climate is one of the topics, and the report will be coming out in February next year, so watch out for that. I just wondered, do you think in these very financially constrained times, organizations might, and I only use the word might put the climate change risk lower down their list of priorities, thinking it's a longer term risk, it's in the future, therefore, for now we need to worry about how we pay our business rates, how we pay our staff, how we support our staff in challenging times, our suppliers, our customers, all of those priorities. So do you think there is a risk that it might dip again in, as we move through 2023, rather than increase in severity?
Well, I think that if organisations do take their eye off the ball on climate, because they're grappling with some of these short-term challenges, then I have to say I think that would be very short-sighted. Indeed, if anything, organisations should be, learning the lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, which were all unforeseen major risk events that have had a really big impact on organisations. They should be learning the lessons and applying it, in terms of how they're preparing for climate change risk, because I believe that climate change risks snowballing into the next big crisis unless organisations get on the get ahead of the curve on this one.
Thank you, Gavin. I think that's a really great point you make there. But you can understand, I'm sure, that the challenges organisations are going to face, and thinking, where do we need to focus resource and money currently? And I know one of the things that we've been talking about at some of our forums is the importance of encouraging, from an internal audit perspective, encouraging our organisations to do some stress testing, looking at what are the key risks, how do we prioritise, and at what point, as we move to the future, do these risks actually impact on the future sustainability of our organization, our ability to survive whatever comes down the track, and also helps us focus on thinking about organizational resilience. So again, I think there's a lot that internal audit can contribute to the conversations at the senior leadership team meetings, at the audit committee meetings, and the information contained within your brilliant Risk in Focus report is going to provide lots of independent, objective information that they can take to these discussions. Do you think?
Absolutely. I really do believe that internal audit has a vital role to play in supporting the organisation, to make sure that it is effectively managing and mitigating, the risks around climate change, because it's no longer just, transition risks around regulatory and legal changes, but we're really now starting to see the physical risks play out right across Europe, as we saw with the heat wave over the summer, and the drought, rivers drying up, mass evacuations because of the sheer heat.
Yeah, it's very true, isn't it? You watch on a news program, massive flooding in Pakistan, and then somewhere else where there's no water, there's water shortages. It seems as though everything has gone a little haywire, doesn't it, at the moment? The other thing worth bearing in mind is that in Spain, they've recently produced some new legislation to try and mitigate the risk of food shortages. So, if you go on holiday to Spain or you live in Spain, you might find that when you go out for a meal, the restaurant will give you what we would probably call a doggy bag, a bag, so that if you leave any food on the plate, you have to take it away with you, so that the restaurant, the hotel is not fined for food waste, because there are such stringent legislations there now. And I think these sorts of things, we ought to be mindful of in terms of, what's happening in whichever country you're in, because often, pieces of legislation that work in one country suddenly materialize in other countries, don't they, Gavin?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for your thoughts around climate change, a risk we need to, as internal audit, be very mindful of. And I think really need to understand where our organization is in this space. So do you have an executive director assigned responsibility for oversight of what your organization is doing in relation to climate, in relation to meeting their targets, etc.? And we as internal audit need to be across some of all of that. So let me move on now, Gavin, and pick up on cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is the #1 risk, again, for the 4th year, despite you producing a great report on cybersecurity at the end of 2021. And one might, if I was being a bit cynical, might say, surely by now, as internal auditors and as organizations, we ought to have got our head around the risk of cybersecurity and the controls in place that would mitigate that risk. Gavin, what are your thoughts around why cybersecurity is #1 again?
Well, I mean, in terms of the survey itself, Liz, obviously we do ask chief audit executives that are completing the survey, what are their biggest risks? And I think, the fact that cybersecurity is still the #1 risk should really come as not much of a surprise. You know, we've had large numbers of the workforce that have been working remotely for much of the pandemic. We've now had the move towards hybrid working, and this of course has created significant challenges for organisations to protect themselves from cyber attacks. This is obviously a risk that's now been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, with an increasingly weaponized cyber attack landscape, as you alluded to in your opening remarks. And in fact, this once again demonstrates how geopolitical risk interlinks, interconnects and exacerbates a range of other business critical risks. One of the key ways that internal audit can help is providing assurance that the organisation has a strong cybersecurity awareness and prevention culture. And this is because an Online Trust Alliance study estimated that 93% of reported cyber incidents could have been avoided with basic cyber hygiene practices. And that was the key message of our cybersecurity thought leadership report, Mind the Gap Cybersecurity Risk in the New Normal, which is also available to download for free on the policy and research section of the Chartered IA's website. We've got some good plugs here on this session, Liz.
Yes, we have. Thank you very much. Great to plug all of the brilliant stuff that you and your team produces. So thank you for sharing that. I think the other thing that struck me, two things in particular around cybersecurity, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to plug another report, was one of the things that is becoming clear is that 80% of fraud appears to be coming through cybersecurity attacks. Tell me about your fraud report, Gavin.
Well, of course, fraud is a risk that has been heightened because of the COVID-19 pandemic, as criminals sought to exploit disruption. But then it's also obviously being heightened through the cost of living crisis, and the temptations for fraud being heightened. And as you say, the vast majority of fraud is now committed through cyber means. So that's exactly why the Chartered IA has done a sort of set piece thought leadership report looking at fraud, which we published only in July, which is also available for free on the policy and research section of the website. So do check it out.
Thank you ever so much, Gavin. I also recall on a session that you did around cyber and fraud and risk in focus, that you talked about a freedom of information request that highlighted, and if I'm sure you'll correct me if I've got this wrong, 10,000 attempted cyber attacks daily against local authorities, which, if you're not in the UK and Ireland, you might call them regional government. That is a phenomenal number, isn't it?
It's a phenomenal number, but I also think it's probably just the tip of the iceberg, because that only takes account of those cyber incidents that have actually been reported. So, I would expect the figure to, in fact, be even higher than that.
So, good point. So, as internal auditors, one of the things I would ask is that you look, as you read Risk in Focus, and Gavin talked about it in chapters, and I absolutely agree with that. And I think chapters is a good way of describing it. But please think about the risks linked. So think about the interlocking nature of all of these risks, because, I can wind the clock back, as some of you may remember. I've talked about how many years I've been in internal audit. where risks used to be in buckets, and you would have a, a recruitment risk, you might have a marketing risk or a sales risk, and nobody looked across. Now, more than ever, as Gavin has just demonstrated, our risks are interlinked, integrated, and the consequences of the risks spread across your organization. So a cybersecurity breach might relate to fraud, it might produce a reputational damage, it might cause you to have data protection breach, it might cause a whole raft of different risks to suddenly start materializing. So when you read this report, please think about all of these risks as they interlink with each other, rather than keeping them solely in their chapters. Think across, because I think that will be helpful to you, to your audit committee, and to your senior leadership team in helping them better understand how these risks impact on them. So going back to the report, there's a graph that both I like and I continually am disappointed by, which is a graph that highlights the risk priorities versus where internal audit is spending its time. And I think it's really helpful. And as you've said earlier, it's not prescriptive, but what I would ask of this graph, and I'm going to turn to you in a minute to share some thoughts, is hold it up to the mirror and ask yourselves, as an internal audit function, are you focusing on those risks that really could stop your organization achieving its objectives, bring it to its knees, in effect, is what I'm going to say? Or are you focusing on those risks that you are familiar with, that you have audited before, that you might want to audit again? So one of the ones in particular, I think, that stood out was macroeconomics and geopolitical. And the graph shows it as a high severity risk. But internal audit focus is missing, is almost non-existent. Do you have any thoughts, Gavin? When you've been talking to people, I know you've done lots and lots of presentations on this report. Have you got feedback as to why that might be?
Well, I mean, I believe it's fair to say that macroeconomic and geopolitical uncertainty is probably not a risk area that internal audit would have traditionally delved into. However, internal audit, without a doubt, now clearly recognises it as a top risk. I think it is nonetheless concerning that this is a risk area that, according to our research, internal audit spends the least time and effort auditing. The important message to get across, and it's one that you just alluded to, Liz, is that geopolitical risk doesn't sit in a silo, but it exacerbates and intensifies a whole range of other business critical risks, such as reputation, cybersecurity, supply chains, legal and regulatory, and even liquidity risk. And I think this really provides a clue as to how some internal auditors may wish to tackle this risk. So rather than do a standalone audit of geopolitical and macroeconomic risk, instead, it may be more appropriate for internal auditors to integrate geopolitical and macroeconomic considerations into existing audits of other risk areas. So, cybersecurity, financial stability, business resilience and continuity, supply chains, and so on. And this may also be the reason why the results may not be fully reflecting the true amount of time and effort that internal audit spends on this risk area. And certainly that's what I've heard anecdotally from internal auditors that I've spoken to.
Thank you for that. And I think you're probably right. I mean, I could just imagine going to my audit committee and saying, you know, I'm about to do an audit on macroeconomic and geopolitical risk, and they're probably going to go, pardon? What exactly are you looking at? So I think it's not about, you know, thinking about those words, but thinking about how that impacts on your organization. So, you know, supply chain, sanctions, you know, those sorts of issues that sit within that, as Gavin said, financial stability, liquidity, cost constraints, you know, all of those issues in terms of better understanding the topic rather than, you know, talking in headline terms. So thank you for that, Gavin. So I want to ask you now, are there any risks, do you think, missing that based on your experience you might have expected to see in the top 5?
Yeah, well, given the spike in energy costs, soaring inflation, rising interest rates, and a looming recession right across Europe in the year ahead, one might have obviously expected financial liquidity and insolvency risk to have featured more prominently. So another key message for people tuning in is obviously this is a risk that you should continue to keep an eye on, a very close eye on, particularly here in the UK.
Thank you, Gavin. It's interesting, we did a Heads of Internal Audit Forum last week, and I asked the same question of a group of internal auditors. And one of the risks that they expected to see, and I think it was probably because of experience within their own organizations, was business continuity or crisis management as the risk that was missing, that they felt and were surprised wasn't in the top 5. Any thoughts, Gavin?
Yeah, I mean, that risk area certainly featured very highly in last year's report as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, you know, I guess it is a little surprising that it didn't feature you know, more highly. But then, you know, there are just so many business critical risks that Internal is having to grapple with at the moment. So they can't all be in the 1 to 5, can they?
No, that's a really good point. And I guess I wonder if it was that the internal auditors that raised it, and a number did, that they were wondering if their organizations, and maybe this is how it fed into the survey, that some organizations had got complacent. You know, we've solved the pandemic, we've ridden that out, we can deal with any crisis. And they were thinking that maybe that's a little misplaced, and were conscious that, you know, for some of their organizations, and it was financial services, private sector and public sector that was raising this, they were saying it's still very much on their radar and something that they are focusing on and including in their internal audit plan. So Gavin, I'm coming to the end of the grilling I'm giving you. So thank you for responding and being kind and attending today. So the report talked about a perfect storm. If, as the report suggests, we are in perfect storm territory, what do you think organizations need to do to start mitigating the risks of this perfect storm?
So, very good question, Liz. As a starting point, internal audit and their organisations need to ask themselves whether the assumptions they've made about the nature of key risks are still valid today and fit for the circumstances that are likely to arise in 2023. You know, do they employ scenario planning? And if so, does this scenario planning sufficiently take into account the circumstances that could arise. I think those 2 points are really, really important in the context of the last few years, where we've had 2 major unforeseen risk events. So, you know, having that foresight, I think it's really, really important. And obviously, I would say that organisations, you know, must harness the skills and talents of their internal auditors in navigating more risky, volatile and uncertain times ahead.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and thank you for the plug about internal auditors. I'm absolutely with you there. So we're coming towards the end of our session, and I'd just like to give you the floor. Is there any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share? Anything that perhaps I haven't asked that you think is worth sharing?
I think I would just end by saying that we do face very challenging times ahead, but given the current climate and the big risks we face, this does also create big opportunities for organisations and internal auditors alike. And it's really vital that the profession fully grasps this opportunity to step up and demonstrate their value.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and great thoughts there. So in conclusion, as businesses battle against soaring energy prices, rising inflation, supply chain issues, disrupted workplace, and so on, as internal auditors, we must, I'll go further than must explore the Risk in Focus 2023 report and the risks identified linked to the level of uncertainty, perhaps more closely than we are currently doing. So if you've just joined us, welcome to our live stream, Talk to Internal Audit. Our guest speaker today, who has been brilliant, is Gavin Hayes, Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Chartered IIA. And today's session was about our annual Risk in Focus 2023 report. So may I say thank you to Gavin for joining me today and for sharing your thoughts with us. Lots for all of us to reflect upon and to share with our internal audit colleagues, senior leadership teams and audit committees. We must read the Risk in Focus 2023 report and share the board briefing, as Gavin mentioned earlier, with our senior managers, the CEO, the CFO, and audit committee chairs and members. The live stream is available afterwards for your friends and colleagues who may have missed the live stream on the Institute's Facebook channel. I hope you're following all the exciting things the Institute is doing on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Our September-October Audit and Risk magazine is available, just in case you've missed it, and its highlights include Dr. Helen Scales on her message to the Internal Audit Conference, training insights on behavioural risk, and how to audit diversity and inclusion in your organisations. And if you are a member of the Chartered IIA, we've recently issued technical guidance on sanctions, which seeks to provide internal auditors with a basic understanding of sanctions and their impact within the UK and Ireland, which is particularly relevant when linked to the macroeconomic and geopolitical risk, as Gavin mentioned earlier. Fraud risk assessment. Even though many risk appetite statements say there is a zero tolerance for fraud, fraud in fact is a fact of life for organisations across all sectors. And with finite resources available to be deployed to fight fraud, it's important for organisations to understand their exposure to fraud risk and the effectiveness of mitigations in place to manage that risk, particularly relevant to the cybersecurity risks that Gavin and I have been discussing. We also have some training courses relevant to today's sessions, which are available on our website. For example, geopolitical risk and the role of internal auditor, including sanctions. Recent events have highlighted the many ways companies, the public sector and charities can be affected, often indirectly by geopolitical disruption. So there's a one-day course that provides an overview on how geopolitical trends globally will increasingly challenge the international business environment, and structured insights into how these trends can create direct and indirect impacts on corporate strategy, financial performance, operational resilience, reputation, and ESG decisions, environmental, social, and governance, in case you've forgotten. This provides the basis for setting out the key ways in which internal audit can provide greater assurance to boards and other strategic stakeholders that their organizations are anticipating and managing the impacts of such a critical area of emerging risk. We also have a training course on auditing fraud and financial crime, which poses significant risks to financial health and stability of any organization. Internal audit need to be in a sound position to provide management with proactive and up-to-date assurances over the effectiveness of controls in these key areas. This course will provide you with the knowledge and tools to audit these risks. And we also have a course on cyber crime and crisis management. Remember, we talked about BCP and crisis management a moment ago. So high-profile technical issues are in the news. A business being hacked, a company being stopped in its tracks because it is under attack, or somebody coming to harm because of a stolen identity. The course will help you better understand cybercrime, cyber incident handling, and the controls that must be in place to help protect your organization. In case you've not already checked it out, the Institute has a community hub for all of you to get involved in, a new gateway to all our community-focused activities and endeavors, including our virtual forums, regional network, and volunteering opportunities. There you'll find a list of all of our special interest groups. So if there are any that pique your interest, reach out. Our community hub is open to all, members and non-members. So watch this space as it continues to take shape over the coming months. As we move forward, please don't forget to look out for Talk to Internal Audit. All of our live streams to date can be found on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't yet watched any, be sure to subscribe. A link to our YouTube channel can be found in the comments section. We will continue to share with you our thoughts regarding specific challenges, along with input from colleagues, members, and guests. So please stay in touch. If you have any specific topics you'd like us to cover, please share your thoughts in the comments box. I'm always happy to take questions via email at liz.sandwith@iia.org.uk. Remember, talk to Internal Audit. The Institute is listening.